we are in the company of Harry, who has done more than most for us free leaseholders. I'm one. And Harry's here to tell the tale of how things are going in his campaign to free leaseholders. And I hope he'll spend a little time explaining how it is that he got involved with pensions, which he has done, and where we're going. So I'm going to shut up now, hand over to Harry. We're recording. Is everyone comfortable? Fingers up. Anyone who doesn't want to be recorded, say now. Okay. Oh, well, over to you, Harry. And we'll ask you questions as we go along, no doubt.
Great. Well, this is a big injustice, and it does sound funny because people think, oh, it's home ownership, you're the haves and not the have-nots. But it's a major thing because every other country in the world, when you buy a flat, you own it outright. You know, you'll have a mortgage, but you'll have a share in the common parts, and then you'll appoint a managing agent who will look after the building. The problem with leasehold, confined to England and Wales in the world, is that basically you have like a sort of parasitical landlord class, like that own the freeholds or the head leases, and then they've basically inserted themselves into your home to extract as much income or rents or fees out of it as possible, with the draconian threat of forfeiture, basically meaning that if a bill is more than £350, in theory, they could take the whole property back and you lose all of the equity based on a small disputed sum. So the fact is that every other country in the world has a form of common hold. So in North America, they call it condominium. They call it condominium in Italy and Thailand as well. There are other, Australia's one of the biggest exports isn't meat, it's actually strata title. That's very popular in parts of Southeast Asia, but also the Middle East have picked it up as a concept. So the thing is, you've basically got democratic self-rule, and it's England and Wales that unfortunately need to get with the rest of the world and join sort of a freehold ownership of flats. And basically, we started this campaign. It used to be called Common Hold now, and we rebranded. But basically, started in March 2023, and the view was, and we spoke to people around Michael Gove and in government as well, and they were like, you're not going to get any legislative change on this. And the problem is that the previous Conservative government had been promising leasehold and common hold reform since 2017. That's when they embarked on a lot of work with the Law Commission, which are like the independent lawyers who would basically go out. They went out to, I find out recently, they've told me off for saying this, but they didn't actually fly out to Australia, Singapore, and Canada, but they've worked very closely with their counterparts in those jurisdictions where they've got successful common hold schemes, loads of consultation, research work from 2017 to 2020. And then there was all these reports that were very well received, very extensive, all about how you actually move away from this leasehold system that has its roots in serfdom and, you know, landlord and serf, basically beast of the field, and the idea that people have this unearned income. And obviously we did manage to help get a bill into the last King's Speech, which was huge because it was like Groundhog Day every year. And I used to be involved in a charity that runs like an all-party group in Parliament. And every time you were being told, oh, it's going to be in the Queen's Speech, oh, it's going to be, you know, it's going to happen next year, and then it never did. So the fact is, we managed to get that happening. Michael Gove was very sympathetic, but it was almost like the number 10 didn't really get this agenda, didn't really back him. And obviously there's massive, deep-pocketed vested interest in this as well. So the bill was there. It was very, thin compared to the hundreds of recommendations from the Law Commission. And one of the big kind of battle points was ground rent. And basically, it was never explicitly stated, but the idea of getting rid of ground rent, and what the idea was is they were going to cap it at a peppercorn. But to do that would have been, and obviously Michael Gove had been touring the studios and had been in Parliament and said he wants to abolish this fundamentally unfair system. And obviously has a bill that doesn't quite do that. So what was one thing that he could do and get the officials, he basically presumably went to the officials and said, what's one thing that would be the single most impactful thing to kind of abolish leasehold without necessarily abolishing it overnight? And it would be to get rid of ground rent, because basically that ground rent is the big kind of blocking point between moving from leasehold to common hold, because that is in the contracts there. That is kind of what the freeholders are expecting. And the thing is that technically they have no right to the illegitimate income streams of insurance kickbacks, giving companies contracts to related companies, vertically integrated managing agents, all of those other income streams. They're not legally have a right to do that. So the thing that's kind of there in the contract that they feel they have kind of a right to is a ground rent. And obviously the proposal was to cap it at a peppercorn, which is zero financial value. And the thing is that then basically we had done a video, I think, before then, and we had worked with a former pensions correspondent at the Financial Times called Norma Cohen. We'd also interviewed a leading actuary, and basically there was a view
that was Peter Tompkins, wasn't it?
Peter Tompkins, exactly.
Yeah.
So basically, there was a very well orchestrated lobby to suggest that if you got rid of ground rent, pension funds would basically crash, locusts will descend, and there was this view that pension funds are lined up in it. And basically, we got a quote at the time from the Pensions and Lifetime Savings Association, and I think they'll always regret having given that quote. And they said I had a very good conversation with their head of media, and basically he was like, look, we wouldn't normally get involved in an issue like this, but given that there are other interests invoking pension funds and interests of our members, we'll obviously go back. I'll check with the top people, but I think there's an understanding of frustration that this is being sort of, wheeled out as a line, and it's really nothing to do with us and our members and our interests. So they came back with a quote in September saying, this is before the King's Speech, pension funds aggregate allocation to all types of property, including commercial as well as residential, accounts for 4% of all pension holdings. None of our members have expressed any concerns of us about proposed changes to rules affecting leasehold and ground rents. Then obviously there was a ground rent consultation that was announced just a few days after the King's Speech. So that allowed them to reverse ferret, and presumably some deep-pocketed interest, maybe one or two outlier members, put pressure on them to change their view. But basically, up until that point, and there was an article in the Times paper months before saying that Michael Gove wants to basically get rid of ground rent, and then there was some deep background saying pension funds may be impacted, but for years. So the backdrop is that the government in 2020 under 2022 banned ground rents on all new flats. PLSA never got involved. No actual pension funds per se or any kind of insurers really were getting involved either in this. So the thing is all quiet. And even in 2019, there was the Parliament Housing Select Committee who had done an amazing review of leasehold. And they had come out and said that all existing leasehold homes will need to be dealt with a cap of £250. And there was someone who would become the housing minister under Boris Johnson, Eddie Hughes, who had basically brought a private members bill to cap it at 250. Labour under Jeremy Corbyn, but had been basically the housing had been given to some very centrist members, one of whom is now the Defence Secretary, John Healey, and another one who's quite senior in the Starmer project, Sarah Jones. They had also committed to a cap of 250. So up until for years, there was no pushback from pension funds or trade associations representing them. But then as soon as that consultation came out, it was again silent. The Financial Times ran a piece, the British Property Federation, all of those sort of usual suspects came out saying pension funds, the Residential Freehold Association, you would say that, wouldn't you? They invoked pension funds. Again, the PLSA wasn't anything to comment. I'm not trying to go off on a rant about the PLSA. And then basically there was the day that the consultation on ground rent closed, so the end of January, they then put out a consultation response published at the back end of the website. So there was no press release, nothing. And there was a member of the Public Bill Committee, Barry Gardner MP, who has an insurance background. Actually, people might not know that, but very interested in insurance, but also ground rent and leasehold, because he was there when the last Labour government tried to get rid of leasehold and didn't, and there was all the vested interest in that. And he obviously quoted back to the Residential Freehold Association, RFA, this quote from the PLSA, and the guy said, "Oh, you might want to check that." And then obviously the PLSA then wrote to the committee saying, "We've resolved you." But the fact is, the data doesn't lie. Less than 4%, or 4% of all pension holdings in commercial and residential. And we did an FOI recently, actually, very interestingly. And because obviously the election had been called, the debate had moved on. But basically, the pensions regulator, who really would know their onions on this, they basically came to us and did a response. And they said across the trust-based pension landscape, defined benefit DB and defined contribution DC, property exposures are predominantly commercial oriented instead of residential. And this is what we had ascertained with one of our videos that had gone viral, 60,000 views, which isn't bad for something as traditionally dry as leasehold. Where there is dedicated residential property exposure, these have typically been through social housing related areas where the investment thesis for generating returns is fundamentally different to a more traditional property investment. While some of the funds that pension schemes use to access property as a whole may have some small allocations to residential property, based on our general market experience, these are limited. Additionally, we don't have the detailed breakdown to look through into which underlying property pension schemes in the UK invested in. In terms of DB versus DC, if this issue is to arise, it will predominantly affect DB schemes, as DC schemes have not to date made meaningful allocations to these assets in their default. For DB schemes, these assets will be illiquid. Therefore, their relative allocation to these assets post Q3 2022 may be larger than their target allocations. However, as noted in the point above, any exposure that may be affected by the relevant reforms are likely to be limited. And also, there were other good people that came out of the woodwork as well. So the Society of Pension Professionals, they came out of their own statement. And while at the beginning it sounds like your heart sinks because it sounded very similar to the new approach of the PLSA, they said freeholders are already prevented from charging ground rents on new long leases of more than 21 years. So it's perhaps understandable that the government wants something similar for existing long leaseholders. The government estimates that capping ground rents at £250 a year would decrease the value of affected property assets by 14.6 billion or 27.3 billion if rents are reduced to peppercorn. If these proposals become law, there may be some short-term impact on pension fund investors through asset values being written down. Certain pension funds may also be impacted where they own the freehold titles directly, although that will be less common. The effect of these proposed adjustments is likely to be more significant for such. So but then it says, I emphasize in this next part, but the scale relative to total assets is probably not that significant for most in the long run. But the fact is that the lobbyists, and don't get me wrong, there are some people that are invoking pension funds like Rothsay Life. There was also a fund that came out later on in disclosures because they had a meeting with Jeremy Hunt, who had actually recused himself from making decisions on this issue. M&G. There are a few others as well. Schroders back fund. So these guys were invoking pension funds, and obviously they've taken on some of the liabilities, but they're not actually pension funds. They're like insurers. And maybe someone can pick me up on my knowledge on that. Maybe it's wrong. But
Harry, I'm gonna
Yeah.
just for a moment, just
Yes.
get you to clarify, because
Yeah.
Barry Mack, one of our chaps, is asking the question. Your position is that you would, as a free leaseholder, want peppercorn ground rents, yeah?
We would, yeah, but yeah, we would we would like that. But the fact is that what had happened at the end is that the previous government had changed its position on this and said they were not going to do peppercorn, and that they were going to do a cap of 250 and a phase out over 20 years.
And basically,
we came out and said, okay, as a compromise, we'd accept that. And the thing is that it's so funny because there was another argument that was being leveled at our campaign, and generally this idea of peppercorn is that there were some people that were elderly who were not, involved in pension funds, but they had spent their pensions buying up these freeholds. Now, obviously, they're going to be few and far between, but I understand that the government, and because of the election, they weren't able to actually really justify why they had done this phase out over 20 years. Was that the argument, I understand it was, it would give those people that were genuine pensioners who are literally so outlier, but who had, there was an article in the Telegraph where they'd spoken to a few of these pensioners who had actually bought some freeholds off, I think, one of these big developers in the 90s in the North and the Midlands. It would give them, 20 years, they would basically be gone by that point, or that they would be able to divest by that point. We would love peppercorn. And I think there was an understanding as well that they would be sued at the European Court of Human Rights against the breach of Article 1, Protocol 1. And I think this new government coming in are a little bit worried about the legal threats. And I think the last government were as well. And there was obviously heavy lobbying. But the thing is that there is a worry that if you get so sucked into ground rents, you then you lose the focus on all of the other issues, which is about who can qualify to buy the freehold. And I think those are going to be the next battleground. Yes, I think we'll accept a £250 cap, but I understand that the new government, they want to go more than that, but maybe they're not convinced of a peppercorn, because there is a risk that the freeholders will sue the government. And even if they don't win, it could be lots of years of government litigation. And then that exposes them to this view of, hang on a second here, why are you getting involved in this court action that's costing, you know, I don't know how much it's going to cost, but it could cost billions of pounds. But the thing is that there is an element of people would be disgusted to know that, you know, something that are about people, fleeing war, persecution, you know, human rights are being weaponized in a way to defend basically like rent seekers and people that are trying to extract wealth. But I think the key thing is that people have paid a premium for their home. And I think this is why people can get distracted on ground rent and other issues in common hold. People have paid a premium for their homes. Even the Residential Freehold Association said that these freeholders that own the freeholds or head leases, they typically own just 2.5% capital value. And it's basically a swindle that people that have paid a premium don't have the control and autonomy that they would associate with home ownership, and that they can't manage their own running costs. And I think that's the big thing. When Hamptons last year came out and said England's flat leaseholders would be paying a £7.6 billion in service charges, that's less money for people doing pensions, you know, setting money aside for a rainy day. There's another question that's come in. Let me pick it up.
Sorry, do you want to ask a question? Then I've got a question after that. So
Okay.
This energy is great, Harry. Thank you.
Harry's focused here on ground rents, understandably, but could you give me an idea of what your actual key targets are? Because I mean, there are many iniquitous things about leasehold in the first place. Frankly, I don't understand why anybody would buy one. Certainly when I was looking at buying houses, if it was leasehold, I would avoid it like the plague. Fleasehold is what people used to refer to it as. But can you give us an idea of what the kind of the key targets are, and in the priority you'd like to see them achieved? So the most important first, because I'm just trying to get
So basically, the brief context is that the King's speech with Labour was about 2 weeks ago now, and they've actually committed, which is amazing, because in the history of leasehold, there's never been two Queen's or King's speeches back to back with legislation on leasehold reform. And as part of their commitment is that they've basically confirmed it, because it was in the manifesto. They said they want to bring further steps to end leasehold on new flats. They've confirmed that all new flats will be common hold. Now that for us is the low hanging fruit. That should have been done when basically the last government were in power, but also Labour. When I was 1 year old in 1995, took me half a decade to find this document. It's been deleted at the British Library. No one wants you to see this. But the late Frank Dobson and also Nick Rainsford, it was one of Tony Blair's first policy prospectuses. He'd signed off on it. It was called An End to Feudalism. All new flats would be common hold. They got into power, and then in 2002, they introduced common hold after Margaret Thatcher and John Major promising it. And then basically they didn't make it mandatory. So millions more of these leasehold debt trap tenancies were created. So we're going to bank that win. That's really important. But for existing, we want to make sure that it's as easy as possible for those that are already shackled to this system, like my mum, who's paying over £30,000 now a year in service charge to a billionaire in Monaco, you know, who clearly it's just about sweating the asset. For us, it's about making sure that the qualifying criteria is like as permissive as possible, because what happens is that successive government bring in new rights for leaseholders to buy the freehold, but then it's been done so cynically that most people will never be able to avail themselves of that right. And the good thing is that in basically the election was called, that legislation that the Tories were pushing and Michael Gove were pushing was going to be dropped. And we caused a huge backlash. Within about 48 hours, we managed to get it into the wash up. And that basically was incredible. But it was the last bit of legislation that Parliament passed. And in there, while it's quite a limited piece of legislation, for the first time, it gives the government powers to set the methodology, the online calculator that will basically decide the deferment and capitalization rates, so that there will be a standardized process now for you to buy out your freehold, which basically means that this whole industry of RICS surveyors and these valuers that come in and value the freeholds, and you have to pay for the freeholders valuer, you have to have your own one, then everyone argues a toss-in tribunal. That will go. So basically what we're trying to do is basically build on the act that was just passed. That Labour have also committed to doing all of the Law Commission recommendations that were not brought in by the Tories. But in that, we want to make sure that if there's a freehold in existence and that the leaseholders have the money, they should be able to buy that. Because at the moment, things like even right to manage, that was a good halfway house. If you didn't have the money to buy your freehold, you'd be able to get management control. That was what the Blair government introduced. But it's so cynical. You have to get 50% of a whole building. And for a lot of these buildings, you've got high levels of buy-to-let or overseas ownership. It's a nightmare being able to get hold of those guys' contact details, but also to mobilize people who might not be living in the building, who do not see the disrepair, who do not, as long as they get their rental yield, they're okay. And the thing is when you speak to people that are involved in that legislation in the olden days, I say olden days, 2002 and the 90s, they all acknowledge privately that there was an element of cynical drafting there to make sure that people will not get control. So what we want to do is try and push, because while there's all these amazing Law Commission recommendations, in certain areas they don't get far enough. And one thing as well, which when you explain it to people, their minds are blown. But when you have a right to buy the freehold, if you can't participate, maybe your family are ill or you've lost your job and you don't have the money at the time, your neighbours can participate and buy the freehold. But going forward, you'll never have a right to buy your share of the freehold going forward. And that's a huge issue, because when they mandate common hold on new flats, we could very quickly see a two-tier market opening up where everyone runs for the new developments and no one touches the existing. And then, or even of those developments that have bought the freehold and then they may convert to common hold, you've got some of you that are basically never in the decision-making process. You've got no control over your outgoings and you're just a pure leaseholder. That's a huge issue. And Zoopla, just a few days ago, and this is why the market leasehold is over as this industry, it's legacy now. Zoopla has just announced that they've now got a toggle on their website where you can now define the property versus freehold, leasehold, or share of freehold, which shocked us because we thought they were going to do a binary of freehold and leasehold. So the fact is that the gap as well after Grenfell between houses and flats is at its widest in 30 years. People are running for the hills. They do not want to buy leasehold because they knew after the fallout from Grenfell is that you've got basically unlimited liability and these freeholders will just decide what you want to pay. And I think no bigger thing on insurance commissions. That is a huge issue. The Financial Conduct Authority got whipped by Michael Gove. They had known about it as the FSA in 2005 or 6, and they didn't actually do any proper enforcement action or any proper investigation. And brokers were even reporting to them, I think 2014, 15, that these products are very simple, a buildings insurance simple to place, and yet there was commissions of up to 60% of a premium going away to brokers, but also managing agents and freeholders. So for us, we just want to make sure that as many leaseholders as possible can buy their freeholds. And if they can't buy the freehold, at least have a universal right to manage, to make sure that basically that's where the money's being made. It's all of the management. It's all on insurance kickbacks.
Harry, is this the number one thing for the free leaseholders now? To get the right
Management
to buy
control.
the freehold? Management
Right
control.
to buy the freehold. And
right
yeah,
to
and if
buy
you can't
or
get
to have management control.
or
Yeah.
right to manage, correct. That for us is number one, because that's
Okay.
where the overcharging is going.
Well, this is my experience, is that we have a managing agent we pay quite a lot of money to, who's supposed to protect us leaseholders. Yeah. Instead, they're in the pocket of the freeholders, and
Yeah.
we've had to explain to the leaseholder agent in the city, yeah, exactly what our displeasure is. They were allowing us to have ground rents calculated on valuations of our property twice the value of the property. And as you know, these things are calculated at 0.1% of the valuation of a leasehold. So we were paying, or we were going to pay twice as much. The leaseholders just sat there supinely, and we had to go in and get valuations done for ourselves, which verified that the leaseholders were actually being doubly overcharged. There seems to be virtually no protection coming from these managing agents at the moment. I think it's an absolute scandal. I don't know if you'd like to comment on that.
Well, the thing is, that's interesting because the Residential Freehold Association have pivoted since the election, since the wash up. Basically, I think they were shell shocked that that act had passed, which was a huge redistribution of wealth from freeholders to leaseholders and a rebalancing of power. But the fact then Labour are going forward, but what they've pivoted to is that they think the answer isn't one of liberation of the consumer, it's actually of regulation of managing agents. And our big concern is, and there was a very respected independent crossbencher in the House of Lords called Lord Best, who's very involved in the housing field. He was commissioned back in 2018, I think, under the Theresa May government, to look into regulation of managing agents and estate agents and across the piece, and come up with a scheme for regulation. Our concern is that if you do that without actually making leaseholders the client, basically the whole power structure, the abusive power structure of the freeholder imposing his will and dictating service charges through their own agent is not going to change. And the fact that the RFA have moved to that, saying this should be a great win for the Labour government, really worries us, because for us, there's issues of regulatory capture. The fact is the FCA did sweet FA for years on the buildings insurance scandal, even though they had been lobbied and petitioned, even by brokers. And the fact is that the idea that you just have a regulator protect you, for us, it's about, and yes, I know of managing agents have actually stole money and stole reserve funds. And the fact is, when you go to the police are not interested. So there needs to be some form of licensing scheme. But for us, we need to make sure that that's not an excuse to keep freeholders in control of managing agents. For us, it's a basic conflict of interest, that the person that appoints the managing agent is the one actually benefiting from increased costs, and they're not the ones paying for those costs. So there's a huge thing that a regulator, while it's important to have like a basic threshold, that it doesn't become used as an ability to sort of, I think the key thing is just to sort of, that could be applied to resident management companies and common hold associations. And I think there's an element of, we need to make sure that leaseholders are in the driving seats or common holders of their own blocks first. And we absolutely then do a licensing scheme or some form of regulation. But I think it's very transparent that some of these freeholder interests are saying, oh, it's a problem about managing agents. I think the thing is, there's a conflict of interest. Any other industry, it's all about eliminating or minimizing conflict of interest. But here, this is so blatant that there's misaligned incentives, that the freeholder is appointing a managing agent and the managing agent is strictly accountable to them, and that leaseholders are kind of locked into a cartel situation, that they're a monopoly, that they can't really, they've got no power of their own to remove the managing agent. And I think that's the key thing, because the managing agent is not working to the interests of the leaseholders.
No, well, this is where it becomes very interesting for pensions, because obviously in our environment, we have agency issues, just as you do, in the housing environment, and we have a pensions regulator. What's weird is that, you know, pensions is probably the biggest store of wealth in the country. Housing is the second biggest store of wealth. We're pretty clear about what our regulators are doing, the FCA and the pension regulator. But it strikes me that you're on your side of things, on the household side, which affects huge numbers of people.
Yeah. In 5.3 million households in leasehold. Yeah, there's nothing. I mean, the only regulator is, people would argue, is the first tier tribunal. I have to admit, if you've ever sat through some of these hearings, it's very stressful. And the fact is that a lot of leaseholders don't have money for legal representation. So you're up sometimes against KCs. And it is something out of the post office scandal, where you're up against huge vested interest, huge power. And, you know, I'm not casting aspersion on surveyors, but you've got a surveyor on the panel. There's an element of, they're very favourable to the represent. You know, I was at a case the other week, and the barrister for the freeholder had been instructed literally on the Friday, and the hearing was Monday or Tuesday, and the judge is almost saying, oh, you know, oh, you've had a tough weekend, old chap, and wanting to make it easy for him. And the fact is that you forget that you've got a litigant in person here who's had to spend considerable hours outside of work amassing all the information, and it was like over £1,000 a page of bundle. And, you know, the thing is that it's not, there's no equality of arms at all. But the fact is, at the moment, all you've got is a tribunal service, and that is a nightmare to navigate, and it's not easy, and it can be years of litigation. They appeal it up to the upper tribunal, it can go above that. People don't have time to be serial litigators. So I think there is a case for a regulator, but the idea that it comes before liberating leaseholders, and that's not a slogan, people being able to buy the freehold or get right to manage or convert to common hold, I think is wrong. And it's worrying that the freeholder lobby are now leaning towards that. And I think there is that issue of regulatory capture. There's also an element of, what if there are good managing agents and they're going to be erecting barriers through a regulator? And I think there is an element of, we need the regulation. You've got it in Australia, New South Wales, but I'm speaking to people over there and they say it's quite rare that managing agents or strata managers, as they're known, lose their license. And there's lots of things like law of agency. There's lots of remedies already out there. And that's been going on where basically the freeholder has been basically using our money held on trust, and he's breached his fiduciary duty to enrich himself. So there's all these concepts, and my concern is that we need a regulator, but it's not the magic bullet. I think the thing is, and I know of people that have got right to manage, or they bought the freehold and then they have been swindled, or literally fraud has taken place, and there's no avenue for them. So the thing is, we need a regulator, but after the liberation, after consumers, because I think there's a big thing. I'll speak to people in other markets. The real thing is, if a managing agent rips you off, you need to use your consumer power to say you're fired, Alan Sugar style. And a lot of these agents then shouldn't be in the market. So I think it's a combination, isn't it, of consumer control and then a regulator when all else fails.
To Porrick's point, your point, the priorities are, first of all, take control, and then improve the regulation so that
and the redress and all of that,
and redress, so people are better protected. But where
Definitely.
I think that everyone in pensions needs to be very concerned about this is not just the fact that the PLSA were captured for a bit.
No.
Some pension schemes have been using these shonky funds, which have been relying on ground rents and the whole freeholders lobby. That kind of like is in a box. The real worry for us,
it's a sideshow in a way.
The big issue is that people are spending hundreds, if not £1,000 a year, paying these bloody ridiculous ground rents, overpaying insurance, having service charges, which are outrageous. And this is stopping the people who should be paying into their pensions. These are workers, from building up pension funds so that they have proper retirement income. And we look at it. We look at this whole business and say, oh, we should be getting people to pay more into their pensions. But we should be releasing people from paying more, so much for their housing. These two.
I wanted to thank you for your support, because people don't really make that connection. And also, obviously, as you know, that there are people that we've, that are saying within the industry they support everything we're doing. But because there's so much politics to it, and I understand that, they don't want to put their head above the parapet, especially if the PLSA situation, there is that worry that, but the thing is, it's basically moving money out of the productive economy, and it's being all salted, a lot of it, away offshore. The fact is that, and hopefully, I think the understanding with this Labour government is that they get that they're wanting to go big for growth, and we're non-partisan. We won't bat any party per se. We just work with whoever's in government. We'll work with opposition and everyone, because for us, this is beyond party politics. But I think there's an understanding that they've had to move on this, especially now with the 1.5 million new homes that they're targeting. They cannot have more of these wealth-eroding leasehold debt traps. And I think there's an understanding there that that's why they're doing the draft legislation. Yes, don't get me wrong, there is a bit of a fear among many leaseholders that for the draft legislation, it means it's not going to be enacted in this session of Parliament, so 24-25. That gives the freeholder lobby more time to arm up, to try new tactics, to push for regulation of managing agents to the detriment of us buying out this asset class, all of that. But the fact is that it means also for us that it gives us a year to really make sure that any loopholes are identified and closed, because that's the problem with leasehold legislation up till now. I think the last act less so, but most previous acts have been poorly drafted, rushed, but then there's been things with more holes than Swiss cheese. So I think that's the key thing, that if we want a productive economy, we need to move away from this corrupt rentier system of leasehold, which is just throwing good money after bad. And also, you're getting services that you're not actually necessarily, you're paying for services that you're not getting. So that, and there's no, and the problem is that people say to me, oh, can't you just put more duties on freeholders to be, like the FCA with fair duty and all of that? No, because for us, it's not going to work, because so long as they've got the monopoly control, abuse will flourish. And I think that's the key thing, that it's unnatural. Every other country in the world, don't get me wrong, residents may fall out of each other, and they do. But the fact is, enlightened self-interest eventually kicks in. When the roof needs doing, they can't sell their flats for what they're worth. Then you get the best managing agent. Then you get the works done. Yes, they may be a little bit more expensive than they should have been, But with leasehold, you can really care about your home, and you can just have your savings, as you've said, plundered. And you've got very little, sometimes nothing you can do about it, unless you just want to serially litigate at tribunal. And that just means sometimes you get credits for the year before, but it doesn't really change the fact that you are, you know, in hock to these freeholders who have got no interest other. And that's the thing, that they can take the incomes out, and for them the building can fall to rack and ruin, and as long as they can get the money out. And I think that's the key thing. And I think the Law Commission did propose this idea of freehold finance, and that's something we're going to be looking at over the next year. That actually, we're not saying low interest, we know the state of the nation is terrible, but maybe the Treasury should be actually seriously considering that for those developments where they can't get the money together, and people pay it back over 30, 40 years. And instead of it being on individual leaseholders, stick it against a freehold title. They do that in Sweden to bring down the overall purchase price of flats because they've got a big issue of land prices. We can do, there is blue sky thinking, but beyond that, this idea that you need to get 50%, it's Soviet style, honestly. For a lot of buildings, you'll never get that. Even of buildings of 12 and 15 units, people cannot get the 50%. So we're hoping
50% of what, Harry?
that the government
50%,
go further.
Clarify this for us, because we don't.
50% of all of the unit holders, so all of the leaseholders you need to get, and that's crazy, because these freeholders go to auction and they don't need to get 50% of directors or anything like that. You don't have to have any qualifications or anything. You can have a criminal record and you can buy these freeholds, and you've got income for life. And I think that's the key thing, that this is not really about leasehold or the way we own flats. This is about the way our economy has been so misguided, that it's moved towards these non-productive assets and this rent seeking. And I think that's why I think our video is, and we know people in the Treasury, they watch our videos. I'm very lucky. I've got a neighbour who's a former sort of London weekend television producer, really helping craft these brilliant videos, and she's kind of the brains behind it. I'm just the
Harry.
I
want you to take this video, which there will be a version of it. I want you to craft it and get the best bits out of it, because there's so much.
That would be brilliant.
There is so much.
Anyone else, because I appreciate your help for the last year or so. Anyone else of your colleagues that wants to get involved from a pensions angle or anything else, anyone that's a leaseholder, anything, because we always need people with pensions and finance background, because the fact is there is a sort of status thing to this as well. We are up against a multi-billion pound industry, people that are very well represented in a lot of these professional organizations, and here I am. Henry says it, and it's true. I'm at the very beginning of my career, but the fact is, you're up against.
You're a scruffy little git who's coming along and making a lot of noise. That's what a lot of people think. Yeah, but
that's
it's not
what they think. And you know what? I'm so lucky that I haven't been touched, touch wood, from threats and all the rest of it. But the fact is, there's been pressure even from people in Parliament that have threatened us. But in terms of like these deep professional organizations, I think they know to sort of generally leave me and our group alone. But the fact is that even the stuff with the PLSA, it was so upsetting to see that we had such good conversations with them, and they had given that statement, and then they had completely resigned. And in their submission to the government, there was none of their own data. And, I was speaking to civil servants, and they said it was unusual. But the fact is, it's all of these other groups that are not necessarily publicly, but they're doing it behind the scenes. And those are the ones that we need your help with, because I think this government are a lot more favourable to this agenda. They're not as conflicted with the fund managers and with those other rentier interests. So I think we are going to get the change. The just question is, we get the detail right, because I think that's a real worry, that they do common hold on new flats and they don't basically do enough radicalism on the existing stock. And I think that's where I think we just need your help and anyone else, because I think it really, these sessions are amazing. I'm delighted to be invited back, to be honest. So
no, it's great. And Derek's just put something really important into chat.
Yes, let me see that.
Which, if you could just want to comment, Scotland is different.
So this is interesting. So the Scotland model, and this was brought up at the Public Bill Committee by actually Barry Gardiner, because he was saying, well, hang on a second, they had few duty in Scotland. There was a big issue with a lot of stock. You had to convert, you had to buy them out. And there was someone from the Scottish Law Commission, and he basically said that they were from a fundamentally different starting point than England and Wales. Because what obviously happened is that they were looking at, I think it was saying 15 or 20,000 needed to be converted. And the fact is, as you've said here, 1974, they started the process of moving away from it much earlier. whereas we've kind of started it in 2022 with the ban on ground rents for new builds, but we haven't really done anything radical on existing stock. And basically, there is this concern that if you go too far, the government will be sued because basically you're doing a kind of Mugabe confiscation without compensation. And obviously, I think there is an understanding from the last government, particularly of Michael Gove, for every lawyer that says that, I can find you another lawyer that says the opposite. But I think that's the worry, that there is a worry about legal threats. And I think the easiest thing is to make sure that as many people as possible qualify to buy the freehold. And given government is setting the rates, this was very interesting. Matthew Pennycook, who was then the shadow housing minister, who's got a brilliant brain. I think he's been involved in policy before he was a politician. He wanted to set a duty on the Secretary of State, then Michael Gove, to make sure that the capitalisation and deferment rates, so how we value these freeholds for the purpose of enfranchisement, buying them out, would be as basically as preferential to leaseholder interests as possible, so as cheap as possible. That wasn't accepted at the end, but he now is a housing minister. So I think the understanding is, and the act that was passed by the Tories, so the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act that got in through the wash up because of our backlash, because it was going to go the way of the Rishi Sunak smoking bill, it was going to be dropped. That basically was all about making the freeholds cheaper and easier to get hold of. So the fact is that the big question is that there now has to be a consultation for the secondary legislation. So we're going to be campaigning to make sure that that is brought forward as soon as possible, because there is stuff in that act. They're getting rid of marriage value for people with short leases, 80 years. That's a huge thing that can double, treble, quadruple the cost of buying out your freehold or extending your lease. That's going. The online calculator is huge. There are also people for mixed use buildings. So if you've got shop or hotel, at the moment you have to have well, before this act was passed, it has to be less than 25%. If you've got more than 25% non-residential premises, you're locked in. You can't buy your freehold. You can't get right to manage, which is crazy, because for those cases, I'm in a mixed-use building, you're more vulnerable because you can be subsidizing the freeholder's hotel or shops or whatever, because he's basically got control of all the cost centers. So that's changing with the act. There are other things about insurance commissions, they'll be banned. And then basically the government will set any fee on insurance that the freeholder will be able to get over many years. So the idea is maybe they set it at £5. So it means that they will not get any fee. Only the broker will get a fee. So, and there's also standardization of service charges. So in theory, across your friends in all different developments, you'll be able to compare and contrast. But obviously,
I'm afraid we're going to have to stop you just for a moment, Harry, because there are probably people on this call who would like to ask you a question.
Please
and if they don't, and I want to throw this open because we only got a quarter of an hour left.
Yes.
Yeah. Anybody on the call want to make a question, send a question to Harry? If not, I'm going to ask another one. Going. You lost your chance. I'm going to ask this next question.
And tell me that I'm wrong, by the way. We don't always think we've always got the right answers.
No. I don't. What I'm interested in is clarification, because you know so much. Yeah. You're talking about acts. Yeah. We had an act which got through at the end of last Parliament. Yeah. What we're now having is a bill to continue the legislation from the last Parliament. Yeah. And
to finish it, correct. So it will be new legislation. So we'll have new legislation, primary legislation. It's going to be called the Leasehold and Commonhold Reform Bill. Labour have committed just a few things on that. One of which is to abolish forfeiture. So we ran a mini campaign on forfeiture.
This is the 350 quid you talked about at the beginning.
350, and that the property can be seized. And I know there is an argument of there's only 80 to 90 successful cases a year out of 5 million. That sounds nothing, but it's a threat of forfeiture. And Norma Cohen was brilliant on this as well, but we spoke to legal experts as well. And we know it because we live this system, that the threat of forfeiture, even if it's not explicit, the idea that if you don't pay your service charges, the whole home could be taken off you, is something that forces compliance with basically service charge gouging, because you don't want to go there. And even mortgage lenders, they put pressure on you to pay the service charge because they lose their security in the terrible event that happens, and it goes through a court procedure. But Harry, it just gives undue power to freeholders and managing agents. So Labour have committed to abolishing it and replacing it with a more proportional system.
And we've got not just a housing minister, but we've got Angela Rayner lined up behind this. So there's some big guns in Parliament really having a look at this. Yeah. And within government. Yeah.
And within government, and there's an element of this is not just a housing thing, this is an economic thing. As you've said, that all this money is being taken out of the productive economy, money that could also be put into business, setting up a family, but also saving money for a pension, for a rainy day. That's all being drained by this extractive system, basically, which has no equivalent in the rest of the world. You know, even Indonesia, India, they all have common hold systems. So we are literally the real outliers. And I think that is the key thing, that it's not just from seeing it from a housing perspective, it's about economic growth. And they want to hit their 1.5 million. So there's the commitment to getting rid of forfeiture. There's a commitment with dealing with unregulated, unaffordable ground rents. It's very vague language at the moment, but there is an understanding that there will be a cap of ground rent. It may not be a peppercorn, but it will probably be a 250 or maybe going beyond that. And then there's also a commitment, all new flats will be common hold. There'll be a separate consultation on that. But beyond that, and then all the Law Commission recommendations. So there are some very good Law Commission recommendations. There's one or two worrying Law Commission recommendations that we're going to have to mobilize against and raise awareness of. Barry's got a question.
Thank you, Barry.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here, Harry.
You devil.
Please do.
So I mean, one of the difficulties I think that we've got here is that property rights in the UK have been sacrosanct and a world renown. That's why the Russian oligarchs have been, were buying property up in London, for example. And my question to you would be, how do you change the system? I agree the system needs to be changed, but how do you change the system without denigrating the reputation we have for property rights, which is largely in everyone's interest?
Well, I think there's an element of changes to property rights have to be well thought out. They have to be consulted upon. There has to be a lot of lead time. That's what we've had with leasehold and common hold reform. The Law Commission, 2017 to 2020, there were so many consultations on that. The government then followed up with their own consultation. But the key thing is that there needs to be some compensation to the freeholders. Now, this basically was litigated against the British state by the Duke of Westminster in the late 1980s. It was very unusual. Margaret Thatcher's government had to defend an act that was passed by the Harold Wilson administration, which was the Leasehold Reform Act, or basically on leasehold houses in 1967. And that gave leaseholders of houses a right to compulsorily acquire the freehold interest or the fee simple and to basically be master of their own destiny. And basically that was upheld at the European Court of Human Rights, saying actually it's not against your human rights because you do get some form of compensation, and how the government and parliament defines that is broadly defined. And I think there's an element of parliamentary sovereignty. If parliament has discussed it, debated it, been consulted upon, they can basically pass that law. And yes, there needs to be compensation. I think that's something that we've been really clear on. We are not saying grab the freeholds for free. Freeholders have a financial interest in our buildings and our homes. They need to be compensated for. The question is, how do you define that? And it's really interesting. If you guys have time, I know how busy guys you are, but there was some fascinating evidence by Professor Tim Lunig, who was one of the masterminds behind furlough, but lots of other reforms in the Treasury, big economist. He gave evidence to the Public Bill Committee in January. And he was basically saying we had this with I think it was furlough, or no, it was one of these schemes during the pandemic. And I think it was about basically backing, going against landlord interests. And they were also saying, we're going to sue you, because I think they had a rent freeze or something like that. And he was like, look, there are many things that the government can do, and they do all the time, that interfere with markets and interfere with people's property rights. And people don't get compensation. So the thing is, and you get it with things like tobacco, oil, people with permits for shale gas and drilling. Then the government comes in, and what they owned was worth something before that policy decision, and then it was collapsed afterwards, and they don't get compensation back. But I am sympathetic to that. We've always said that freeholds are not for free, but it's about giving compensation. And the thing is that now government can set the compensation with the online calculator. That is going to get rid of a lot of the kind of arguments and a lot of the costs. And also another thing is, up until this act that's just passed, leaseholders will also have to pay for the freeholders' legal and professional fees. in no other part of the economy is there an equivalent of that, which is just, that was crazy. So but I get your point about stability, about property rights, but these changes have been so extensively consulted upon, and again, they're going out to consultation again. So this online calculator, everyone is going to have an opportunity to say that the rates, and the freeholders want the rates set as low as possible, so it's as favourable to them as possible, and obviously we want them as high as possible, so they're as cheap as possible for us. So the thing is, there's a big fight going on. It's not over, but I think the element is that freeholders only own 2.5% capital value. So actually their property rights, pretty minuscule. And you know what? The rights to gouge people in their own homes, they don't have a right to do that. They have a right to ground rent. And I think that's why ground rent was so charged, because they did have that. That was there in the contracts. But I think the Competition and Markets Authority, which shocked us all, came out and basically said ground rents were neither legally nor commercially necessary. And they were basically implying that because it provides no service or benefit to the consumer or end user, they should be peppercorned. And this is like quite a, it's supposed to be kind of a government regulator, isn't it, in a way? It's not supposed to be so political.
Okay, so this is to do with authenticity and verification and all
and
these things.
Consultation, yeah, and making sure some compensation.
Yeah. So anyway, we've got another question, Chris.
I agree with you that we have to do this in a careful way. Yeah.
In a careful way, Chris.
Yeah.
Bumford, do you want to sort of say? Yeah.
Thanks, Henry. Yeah, thanks, Harry. Really interesting conversation. I mean, not so much a question really as an observation that as you've been talking through it, I've been kind of because I didn't know loads about it before today, and sort of seeing how other people were setting the amounts, how freeholders were setting the amounts leaseholders would pay. And I was just thinking really about the comparisons with the pensions industry that we work in terms of trustees set the prices, effectively set the contributions that companies have to pay, and then there's a little bit of discussion, but really there's kind of not a lot they can do about it in terms of going through. And it was really interesting hearing how you were sort of seeing about getting the law changed to make that change. And I know that trustees are doing a great job in terms of protecting members, but I also know that company sponsors sort of feel a little bit powerless sometimes in terms of what they can do to influence how that money is invested and how that money can change. And it was just a sort of open thought really about whether the sort of laws surrounding trusts and in the pensions world, whether they could potentially be looked at in future as well. It's not a fair one for you, Harry, but just a sort of more an observation point really about the sort of parallels between the two.
Pay grade, but there is a pensions bill, isn't there, in the King's Speech? I don't know whether that has any knock on there, but you're right, it's a big structural thing, and it's also about conflicts of interest and whether the incentive structure is working right. I think there's definitely parallels, probably, isn't there?
Well, we get an awful lot of attention on this whole business of balance of powers between trustees, employers, regulators. There's a sort of triangulation that's been well talked about for 25, 30 years now. And the point I was making earlier is that we really understand those balance of powers. And, when there is a change, it's much talked about, consulted on, and we get on and do it. And by and large, our system works well. By comparison, everything that you talked about this morning suggests to me that there is no balance of power between the freeholder and the leaseholder.
There isn't.
There isn't a proper system of control, and therefore you are hostage to fortune as to whether you have a hostile or a helpful freeholder. And for all these reasons, the comparisons are really, really important. It's not just that the amount we pay for our housing impacts the amount we pay for our pensions and vice versa. Yeah, it's about that huge numbers of pensioners are actually leaseholders too. And this argument that somehow pensioners are going to be done in by the abolition of, say, ground rents is so perniciously wrong. Because these pensioners, and your mum is one of them, I guess she's probably close to pension age, huge numbers of pensioners are victims of this system. So we can't say it's not our business. Yeah, I know the pension playpen would not normally do a couple of things on housing, but it is our business. It is very much our business because it's the business of society. And we're coming to the end now, so I'm just going to allow you to really wash up, Harry. And I know you can on the another half an hour, but you've got 2 minutes.
Yeah, no, we did polling earlier in the year, and it said pensioners, so people over the age of 65 in the UK, were most favourable to getting rid of ground rent, and they're also most favourable to getting rid of leaseholders as a system. And the fact is that elderly downsizers, you know, when the kids have left to university, they've got, you know, they've gone and got jobs in London, they're all looking at flats, and that is another huge scam. Retirement flats, we don't do so much on that, but these flats where, you know, when the mother or father dies, the heirs are stuck with these flats for years because they can't sell them because of the service charge. But yeah, I think the focus for us is that this is a wealth extracting, wealth destroying, rentier corrupt scheme. And don't get me wrong, there are good individual freeholders. I've met a few over the years of my campaigning, but it's not about individuals. It's about a system that is geared to exploitation and that has no other equivalent in the rest of the world. All other countries, jurisdictions have common hold like schemes where you are master of your own destiny and you appoint the managing agent. If they rip you off, you're Alan Sugar and you're fired. So we want to move to that. And that's what's really exciting, because I think the freeholder lobby, they know that the time is up. So they're wanting to stall it with regulation of managing agents as a way of distracting that they will still be on our homes. And I think that's the key thing, that we make sure that Labour do the job that I think Gove wanted to do and was prevented from doing, because there were rentiers in the Conservative Party and people close to those.
Yeah, but this is not about politics. This is about fairness, isn't it, Harry?
It's about fairness. And the fact is, it's making sure that this new government gets on and does it, because we've had now 7 years of work. Successive governments have promised to get rid of it. Margaret Thatcher's last day as Prime Minister, there was a common hold draft bill. You know, John Major in 1996, common hold draft bill. Yeah. We've had all the chat about it. We've had all the talking shops. We now need to get on and do it and make sure as well, and which is what we're going to really key on, is we don't create a two-tier market, that we just have common hold for new. Everyone runs for the new flats and then they avoid the existing. We're all shackled, you know, in this financial servitude to freeholders with existing blocks of service charges. So we want to make sure that in some key areas we go beyond the Law Commission recommendations, and that should be no skin off this government's nose. They want to do it properly, and they've got time. It's not like the end of years of one party in power. It's at the beginning. We've got 1 year to get the draft bill right. I'm sure there'll be probably a bill committee as well, and that's where people will be giving evidence and feeding into the process and making sure that the proposed law is as watertight as possible.
On that note, we've all got a right to respond to that consultation, and I hope that a few of the people on this call will do. Yeah, we've got to the end of our session, Harry, but it's been great. It's been fab to have an hour's worth of passion and vigor for life, which we've never seen before. So thank you very much, my friends. Steve,
Harry, fantastic, Harry. Really enjoyed it.
Over to you, and if you would do your usual homily at the end. Some applause.
Big applause from me and everybody. I think fantastic. I think the biggest thing that comes across, Harry, is passion, and good to see a young person, especially in our field, have passion for change. And I think if anybody, reiterating you and Henry's words, if anybody can help push this through, then great. You know, I think that's fantastic. And we will get you back, Harry. You know, we do these sessions.
Oh, bless you. Honestly, I think you're going to put out a restraining order, but this was lovely. Thanks. But yeah, anyone, even if it's privately, mention it at, a networking drink saying, oh, ground rent, there's pen. If you can push back on that, because it's not true.
Yeah. Anything we can do to help. Yeah.
We'll get the video out.
We'll get the video out this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. And then we'll get it forwarded to you, Harry. You'll get it edited, and then let's just get this stuff out to a bigger, wider world, so we get rid of this housing injustice. And thank you very much to everybody on this call, but we have to close it down now. So thanks, Harry, again.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Really appreciate it.
Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much. Take care. Bye. Bye.